Millionaire sees a boy who looks just like him. He's the secret child from his ONS with his wife. The room was alive with chatter, the kind of hum that only comes from mingling the elite with the ambitious. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, iconic in its golden splendor, shimmered under the weight of crystal chandeliers. Tonight, New York's most influential had gathered to celebrate the Hayes Foundation's latest milestone, a $10 million donation to educational programs for underprivileged children. Alexander Hayes, the man of the hour, stood near the stage, his tailored Armani tuxedo fitting him like a second skin. At 37, Alexander embodied success, a self-made millionaire with a sharp mind, a sharper tongue, and a reputation for turning failing businesses into gold mines. He glanced at his Rolex Submariner, subtly checking how much longer he had to endure the adoration of the crowd. "Mr. Hayes, your generosity is unmatched," a woman in her 40s gushed, her diamond necklace catching the light as she leaned in. "It's inspiring to see someone of your status give back so profoundly." Alexander offered her a practiced smile. "The real credit belongs to the team that implements these programs. I'm just the guy who signs the checks." The woman laughed, overly charmed, but Alexander's attention drifted. He wasn't in the mood for small talk, not tonight. From the corner of his eye, he spotted his PR director, Amanda Sterling, approaching. Her dark green dress was tasteful but commanding, as was her usual demeanor. She carried a clipboard in one hand, her phone in the other. "Alex, we're ready for your speech," she said in a low voice. "Can we skip it?" he replied, half joking. Amanda raised a brow. "The press is here, and the board is watching. You skip it, and you'll have to endure 3 months of damage control." With a resigned sigh, Alexander straightened his jacket. He made his way to the podium, each step measured and deliberate. The applause swelled as he reached the microphone, but it felt distant, almost muted. He looked out over the sea of faces, the wealthiest and most powerful in New York City. Yet as he began his speech, he couldn't shake the hollowness creeping in. Later that evening, Alexander stood at the bar, nursing a glass of Glenfiddich 18 neat. The gala had gone off without a hitch, smiling photos, generous pledges, and a round of obligatory congratulations. But now, as the ballroom began to empty, the weight of solitude pressed against his chest. "Looks like you've outdone yourself again," a familiar voice said behind him. He turned to see Richard Calloway, a venture capitalist and occasional business rival. Richard was older, in his 50s, with a silver mane that matched his expensive tastes. "Richard," Alexander greeted, raising his glass. "Didn't think you'd show up?" "I make a point to watch my competition," Richard said, smirking. "Plus, your foundation's work aligns with one of my new ventures in education." Alexander gave a non-committal nod. He wasn't in the mood for Richard's usual backhanded compliments. "By the way," Richard added, swirling his bourbon, "heard an interesting story about you the other day. San Francisco 10 years ago. A charity event, wasn't it?" Alexander stiffened, but kept his expression neutral. "I don't recall." Richard chuckled. "Of course you don't. The past always has a way of slipping through cracks when you're building empires. It was a gala, not unlike tonight, hosted at the Ritz-Carlton in San Francisco. He had been younger then, less disciplined, more reckless, and it was there he met Isabella. He remembered her vividly, her auburn hair catching the soft glow of the chandelier, her laugh unguarded and full of life. She wasn't like the women he usually met. She didn't fawn over him or play coy. She was real, confident, magnetic. And for one night, Alexander had allowed himself to forget the rules he lived by. No attachments, no complications. By morning he had left, leaving behind a note that simply read, "Thank you for a wonderful evening. Take care." He hadn't thought of Isabella in years, but now a dull ache settled in his chest, a mix of regret and something he couldn't quite name. Was it guilt? Curiosity? As the car pulled into the underground parking of his luxury high-rise on Fifth Avenue, Alexander shook off the thought. The past was the past. He had built his life by looking forward, not back. Yet as he stepped into his penthouse and stared out at the city that seemed to stretch endlessly below him, he couldn't shake the image of Isabella's face from his mind, or the feeling that something or someone was missing. The morning sun filtered through the glass walls of Alexander's penthouse, casting long golden streaks over the polished wood floors. He sat at his dining table, an untouched cup of espresso in front of him. His phone buzzed incessantly, emails, texts, meeting reminders, but he barely registered the noise. Instead, his gaze drifted out over the cityscape, where a faint layer of mist hung between the skyscrapers like a veil of forgotten dreams. For the first time in years, his mind wasn't occupied with strategies or stock performance. Instead, a single face lingered in his thoughts: Isabella Monroe. He hadn't allowed himself to dwell on that night in San Francisco. It was easier to compartmentalize, to shove inconvenient emotions into the farthest corners of his mind. But Richard's passing comment had cracked the dam, and now memories spilled out like an uncontrollable flood. The memory of her laughter light and genuine rose unbidden. She hadn't been impressed by his wealth or power. In fact, she had teased him, calling him Mr. Serious after he'd tried to pitch himself as an ambitious entrepreneur. For one night, she had reminded him what it felt like to be human. And then, like a coward, he'd walked away before morning light could reveal any cracks in the walls he'd so carefully built around himself. The sound of heels clicking on the marble floor pulled Alexander from his reverie. Amanda Sterling, his PR director, walked into the room, her green leather portfolio tucked under one arm. She was a force of nature, sharp, efficient, and completely unfazed by Alexander's mood swings. "I tried calling," she said, setting the portfolio on the table with a thud. "You're late for the investment committee briefing." Alexander blinked, glancing at the clock on his phone. "Reschedule it." Amanda narrowed her eyes. "We've already rescheduled it twice. What's going on?" He waved her off, leaning back in his chair. "I just need a minute, Amanda." Her gaze softened for a moment, a rare occurrence. "Is this about Calloway? I saw you two talking last night. Did he get under your skin?" Alexander hesitated, then shook his head. "No, it's something else. Something personal." Amanda raised a brow but didn't press further. "Fine, I'll handle the committee. But you need to pull yourself together. The board is already wary about your solo acquisitions. If they sense you're distracted, I said I'll handle it." Alexander cut in, his tone sharper than intended. Amanda sighed and left the room, her heels echoing as she disappeared down the hall. Later that day, Alexander found himself in the back seat of his Mercedes-Benz, heading toward an event in Queens. It wasn't the kind of place he usually visited, a modest community fundraiser to support a struggling public school, but his PR team insisted it was good optics for the Hayes Foundation. As the car pulled up to the event, Alexander's mood darkened. The venue was a simple gymnasium, its exterior peeling with age. A large banner reading "Together for Tomorrow" hung above the entrance, swaying slightly in the breeze. Inside, the scene was equally unremarkable. Folding chairs arranged in rows, a makeshift stage at the far end, and volunteers scrambling to set up refreshments on a table draped in cheap plastic. Alexander tugged at his tie, already regretting his decision to attend. But then, someone caught his eye. At the edge of the room, a woman knelt beside a young boy, helping him adjust the collar of his shirt. Her auburn hair gleamed in the dim light, and even from a distance, her voice carried a warmth that made Alexander freeze in his tracks. It was Isabella. For a moment, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. But then the boy turned, and Alexander's breath caught in his throat. The child, no older than 9, was a mirror image of himself at that age. The same sharp jawline, the same unruly dark hair, even the same stubborn tilt to his chin. "Mr. Hayes," a volunteer interrupted, gesturing toward the stage. "We're ready for you." Alexander nodded numbly, but his feet didn't move. His eyes remained locked on Isabella and the boy. She hadn't noticed him yet, too focused on smoothing the boy's shirt and whispering something that made him laugh. The sound of the child's laughter sent a shiver down Alexander's spine. It was light, carefree, and eerily familiar. Who was this boy, and why did Alexander feel an inexplicable pull toward him? As the event unfolded, Alexander barely heard the speeches or the applause. His mind was consumed by questions. When the program ended, he lingered near the refreshment table, hoping for a chance to approach Isabella without drawing attention. She was talking to another volunteer when their eyes finally met. For a moment, she froze, her expression a mixture of shock and something else, resentment, perhaps. "Alexander," she said, her tone cool but polite. "I didn't expect to see you here." He searched for words, but found none. Finally, he managed, "Isabella, it's been a long time." Her eyes flicked briefly to the boy, who was now talking animatedly with another child across the room. "Yes, it has." Before he could say more, Isabella turned her attention back to the volunteer, effectively ending the conversation. But Alexander wasn't ready to let it go. He couldn't ignore the resemblance between himself and the boy. He couldn't ignore the questions clawing at his mind. The city moved with its usual rhythm, but for Alexander, everything felt off-kilter. The honking of cabs and the chatter of pedestrians outside his office at 1 Vanderbilt seemed muted, distant. He sat at his desk, a towering mahogany piece that exuded power, yet he felt small against the weight of his thoughts. On the corner of his desk lay a framed photograph, a rare personal touch in his otherwise pristine office. It was a picture of him at age 9, standing proudly beside his late father, Mark Hayes, in front of their modest 2-bedroom house in Albany. Alexander had always thought the sharp cheekbones and defiant smirk in the photo were uniquely his, inherited from his father. But now he couldn't help but see another face overlaid on that memory, the boy at the community event, Ethan. The resemblance was undeniable. Alexander stared at his computer screen, but the spreadsheets and projections seemed like gibberish. His focus kept slipping back to Isabella and Ethan. He had left the event without pressing further, unsure of how to breach the subject without unraveling years of carefully constructed emotional barriers. But the questions refused to stay silent. Who was Ethan? Why hadn't Isabella ever reached out to him? And why did she look at him last night with that guarded mixture of anger and hurt? Unable to concentrate, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. Amanda's voice buzzed through the intercom. "Alex, you've got a call from Everworth Ventures. Do you want me to take a message?" He interrupted, his voice unusually curt. There was a pause before Amanda replied, "Understood." For once, Alexander didn't care about business. He needed answers. Later that evening, Alexander found himself standing outside an unassuming building in Brooklyn. The address belonged to a small, family-owned non-profit called Bright Futures Foundation, focused on providing resources to single mothers and their children. Isabella was its founder and director. The decision to come here had been impulsive, spurred by a restless night and a stubborn refusal to let the questions fester any longer. He didn't know what he hoped to achieve, but he couldn't sit idly by. The door creaked open as he stepped inside. The space was modest but inviting, with warm lighting and walls adorned with children's artwork. The faint smell of coffee and baked goods lingered in the air. A young receptionist looked up, startled by the sight of him. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice hesitant as she took in his tailored coat and polished shoes. "I'm here to see Isabella Monroe," he said, his tone polite but firm. The receptionist hesitated before nodding. "She's in the back office. Let me check if she's available." As she disappeared down the hallway, Alexander's eyes wandered. On a nearby bulletin board, he spotted a photograph of Isabella holding a pair of oversized scissors at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Ethan stood beside her, grinning widely. The caption read, "Bright Futures opens new community center." The boy's smile tugged at something deep within Alexander. It wasn't just the resemblance, it was the familiarity. The way Ethan tilted his head, the mischievous glint in his eye. It was like staring at a younger version of himself. "Alexander." Her voice startled him. He turned to see Isabella standing a few feet away, her arms crossed. She wore a simple blouse and jeans, but her presence was commanding. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone wary. "I needed to see you," he said, his voice steady but softer than usual. "We didn't get a chance to talk last night." "There's nothing to talk about," she replied, but her eyes betrayed her words. They held a flicker of unease, as if she'd been bracing for this moment. Alexander took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "Isabella, I'm not blind. That boy Ethan, he's mine, isn't he?" Her breath hitched, and for a moment she looked as though she might deny it. But then her shoulders sagged, and the fight drained from her expression. "Yes," she said quietly, "he's your son." The words landed like a punch to the gut. Alexander's carefully constructed world tilted, and for a moment he couldn't speak. He had spent years chasing success, building an empire, convincing himself that the sacrifices were worth it. But now, standing here, he realized he had missed something far more profound. "Why didn't you tell me?" he finally asked, his voice tinged with frustration and hurt. Isabella's eyes flashed. "Tell you? You left, Alexander. You didn't even give me your real number. All I had was a note that said, 'Take care.' What was I supposed to do? Hunt you down and beg for help?" Her words stung because they were true. He had walked away, assuming their encounter was nothing more than a fleeting moment in his otherwise calculated life. "I didn't know," he said, his voice low. "I didn't know you were pregnant." "And what difference would it have made?" she shot back. "Would you have dropped everything to be a father, or would you have written another note and disappeared again?" Alexander opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He didn't know what he would have done. The truth was, the man he had been back then wouldn't have been ready for this for her, for Ethan. A tense silence settled between them. Isabella sighed and gestured toward a nearby chair. "You might as well sit down." Alexander obeyed, feeling uncharacteristically unsure of himself. He watched as she sat across from him, her expression guarded but not unkind. "Ethan doesn't know," she said after a moment. "I never told him about you. As far as he's concerned, it's just been me." Her voice softened, and Alexander caught a glimpse of the woman he had once known, the warmth, the resilience. But there was also a weight in her tone, a weariness that hadn't been there before. "I did what I had to do," she continued. "I raised him on my own. I built this foundation to give him and kids like him a better chance." Alexander's chest tightened. He thought of all the times he had been lauded as a visionary, a trailblazer. Yet here was Isabella, quietly doing something far more meaningful, without fanfare or recognition. "I want to be part of his life," he said, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. Isabella looked at him, her eyes searching his face for something, sincerity, perhaps, or a reason to trust him. "It's not that simple, Alexander. You can't just walk in and expect to play father. He doesn't know you, and I'm not sure I want him to." Her words were like a slap, but Alexander didn't back down. For the first time in years, he felt something deeper than ambition driving him. "I made mistakes," he admitted, "but I'm here now. And I'm not walking away this time." Isabella studied him for a long moment before finally nodding, though her expression remained cautious. "We'll see, Alexander. But this isn't just about you anymore, it's about Ethan, and he's my priority." Her words hung in the air, a challenge and a warning. Alexander knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but as he left the foundation that evening, he felt a spark of determination igniting within him. For the first time, he wasn't chasing a deal or a profit margin. He was chasing something far more important, the chance to right a wrong and earn his place in the life of the boy who might just be the best thing he'd ever created. The following days passed in a blur of meetings and obligations, but Alexander found himself only half present in the life he had so meticulously crafted. His office, usually a sanctuary of control and productivity, felt more like a gilded cage. Every email, every phone call, every handshake seemed insignificant against the storm swirling inside him. He couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. The boy's image was imprinted on his mind. The way he had laughed with unbridled joy, the glint of curiosity in his eyes, and most haunting of all, the undeniable resemblance to himself. Alexander had always believed his legacy would be built through his company, the investments he made, the innovations he pioneered. But now, the idea of a different kind of legacy, a human one, began to take root. It was a cool Saturday morning when Alexander found himself standing outside Bright Future's foundation once again. The modest building looked even humbler in the daylight, its brick facade weathered but well maintained. Isabella had been reluctant to give him this opportunity, but after hours of negotiation, she had agreed to let him spend some time with Ethan. Under supervision, she had emphasized, her tone leaving no room for argument. Alexander adjusted the collar of his cashmere coat and took a steadying breath. He wasn't used to feeling nervous, not in boardrooms, not in negotiations, and certainly not in front of anyone. Yet here he was, his palms slightly damp and his mind racing with the weight of what was about to happen. The door opened before he could knock, and Isabella stood there, her expression cautious but not unkind. She wore a simple sweater and jeans, her auburn hair pulled back into a loose ponytail. She looked different from the polished woman he remembered from years ago, less guarded, more grounded. Yet her presence still carried the same quiet strength that had captivated him back then. "He's in the playroom," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I told him you're here to help with some of the activities today. He doesn't know who you are." Her words stung, but Alexander nodded. "I understand." Isabella studied him for a moment before leading him down a narrow hallway. The sounds of laughter and chatter grew louder as they approached a brightly painted room at the end of the corridor. The walls were adorned with hand-drawn pictures and inspirational quotes written in children's handwriting. It was a far cry from the sleek, minimalist aesthetic Alexander was used to, but there was a warmth here that his office had never known. Inside the playroom, Ethan was busy constructing an elaborate tower of blocks with another child. He was wearing a bright blue sweatshirt and sneakers that looked a little too big for him, as if he'd grown faster than his wardrobe could keep up. His dark hair was slightly messy and his face was lit up with concentration. "Ethan," Isabella called softly. The boy looked up, his eyes sparkling with curiosity. "This is Mr. Hayes. He's here to help out today." Ethan tilted his head, studying Alexander with a look that was far too perceptive for a child his age. "You look like me?" he said bluntly, his voice filled with innocent wonder. Alexander felt his heart skip a beat. He managed a small smile, crouching down to meet Ethan's gaze. "I guess we do look a little alike," he said, his voice steady despite the knot in his throat. Ethan grinned, clearly pleased by the idea. "Want to help me build this tower? It's going to be the tallest one ever." "I'd like that," Alexander said, lowering himself to the floor. For the next hour, Alexander immersed himself in Ethan's world. They built towers, raced toy cars, and even attempted a messy art project that left Alexander with paint smudges on his shirt. For a man who lived by schedules and precision, the chaos was strangely liberating. He watched Ethan closely, noting the small things a determined set to his jaw when something didn't go as planned, the way he scrunched his nose when he was deep in thought. It was like looking into a mirror, but it was also something more. Ethan's exuberance, his openness, his boundless curiosity, they were qualities Alexander had long since buried beneath layers of ambition and detachment. Isabella lingered near the doorway, her arms crossed as she observed the interaction. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. When it was time for lunch, the three of them sat at a small table in the corner of the room. Ethan chattered non-stop, recounting stories about his school friends, his favorite cartoons, and his dream of becoming an astronaut. Alexander listened intently, hanging on every word as if it were the most important business proposal he'd ever heard. "Do you have kids, Mr. Hayes?" Ethan asked suddenly, his big eyes filled with curiosity. The question caught Alexander off guard. He glanced at Isabella, who tensed slightly but didn't intervene. "No," Alexander said carefully, "but if I did, I think they'd be a lot like you." Ethan beamed at the compliment, completely unaware of the weight behind Alexander's words. Isabella, however, looked away, her jaw tightening. As the day came to an end, Alexander found himself reluctant to leave. Ethan had fallen asleep on a beanbag chair, a picture book still clutched in his hands. Isabella gently draped a blanket over him before turning to Alexander. "He likes you," she said quietly, her voice tinged with both relief and caution. "I like him too," Alexander replied, his tone earnest. "He's amazing." Isabella folded her arms, leaning against the doorway. "This doesn't change anything, Alexander. You can't just drop in and out of his life. If you're going to be a part of it, you have to commit fully." "I know," he said, meeting her gaze, "and I will. Whatever it takes." Isabella studied him for a long moment before nodding. "We'll see." Her words were guarded, but Alexander sensed a small crack in her defenses. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him hope. That night, as he sat alone in his penthouse, Alexander replayed the day in his mind. For the first time in years, his focus wasn't on profits or strategies or the relentless pursuit of success. It was on a boy with dark hair and curious eyes who had unknowingly changed everything. Alexander didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was clear. He was no longer the man who left a note and walked away. This time he was staying. The day with Ethan had stirred something in him. For years, Alexander had prided himself on his control, his ability to compartmentalize emotions, to focus solely on the future without being tethered to the past. But now, his carefully constructed walls felt paper-thin. The boys' laughter, the way he had innocently declared their resemblance, and the ease with which he had accepted Alexander into his world, they played on a loop in his mind, relentless and unyielding. As the elevator ascended, Alexander leaned against the mirrored wall, his reflection staring back at him. For the first time in a long while, he didn't see the confident CEO or the master negotiator. He saw a man grappling with the weight of his own choices. The penthouse was dark when he entered, save for the faint glow of the city lights streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light as he settled into a leather armchair. The silence felt heavier tonight, not the kind he welcomed, but the kind that gnawed at him, exposing the cracks he tried so hard to hide. Alexander reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found a name he hadn't seen in years. Marcus Hayes. His father. Marcus had died over a decade ago, a heart attack claiming him far too early. They hadn't been close in the traditional sense. Marcus was a disciplinarian, a man of few words but unyielding expectations. Yet despite their strained relationship, Alexander had always sought his father's approval, even in his absence. He stared at the name on the screen, his thumb hovering over the call button. Of course, there was no one to call, but the act itself felt like a plea, a desperate grasp for guidance. The next morning, Alexander stood in the conference room of Hayes Industries, addressing his senior leadership team. His words were sharp, his tone decisive, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The presentation on quarterly growth projections blurred together, the charts and graphs losing their usual allure. "Mr. Hayes?" Amanda's voice cut through the fog. Alexander blinked, realizing the room had fallen silent. Amanda was looking at him, her expression carefully neutral, but tinged with concern. "Do you have any additional input on the expansion strategy for the European market?" she asked, her voice measured. He cleared his throat, regaining his composure. "The numbers look promising. Push the launch date forward by 2 weeks and allocate additional resources to the London team. I want a full report by Monday." The team nodded, jotting down notes before filing out of the room. Amanda lingered, her clipboard tucked under one arm. "You've been distracted," she said once they were alone. "This isn't like you." Alexander sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've got a lot on my mind." Amanda tilted her head, her sharp eyes narrowing. "Does this have anything to do with the non-profit you visited last week? Or the kid?" Alexander stiffened. He hadn't shared details of his visit with anyone, but Amanda was nothing if not perceptive. "It's complicated," he admitted, his voice low. Complicated isn't your style, she replied. You're a man who solves problems, Alex. If this is personal, deal with it. Don't let it fester. Her words, blunt as they were, struck a chord. Alexander nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what dealing with it looked like. That evening, Alexander found himself back at Bright Futures Foundation. The building was quieter this time, the hum of activity replaced by the muffled sounds of paperwork and quiet conversation. Isabella was in her office, her desk piled high with folders and documents. She looked up as he knocked softly on the doorframe. "Back so soon?" she asked, her tone laced with cautious curiosity. "I needed to talk to you," Alexander said, stepping inside. "About Ethan." Isabella set down her pen, folding her hands on the desk. "What about him?" Alexander hesitated, searching for the right words. "I want to be part of his life. Not just in passing, not just as a visitor. I want him to know who I am." Her expression hardened. "And what exactly does that mean? That you'll swoop in, play father for a few weeks, and then disappear when it gets inconvenient? That's not fair," Alexander said, his voice steady but firm. "I know I've made mistakes. I know I wasn't there when you needed me. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Isabella leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing. "You say that now, but you don't know what it takes. Being a father isn't just about showing up. It's about consistency, sacrifice, and putting someone else's needs above your own. Can you do that, Alexander? Can you really commit to something beyond your career?" Her words stung, but Alexander knew they came from a place of truth. He had spent so long chasing success that the idea of sacrificing anything for someone else was foreign, almost frightening. But Ethan deserved better. He deserved a father who was willing to try. "I don't have all the answers," Alexander admitted, his voice softer now. "But I'm willing to learn. I'm willing to try." Isabella studied him for a long moment, her gaze searching his face for sincerity. Finally, she sighed. "This isn't just about you and Ethan. It's about what's best for him. And right now, I'm not sure what that is." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Alexander nodded, knowing that trust wouldn't come easily, that he would have to earn his place in Ethan's life, step by cautious step. But as he left the foundation that night, the resolve in his chest burned brighter. He had faced countless challenges in his life, but none as important as this. For the first time, Alexander wasn't fighting for a deal or a company. He was fighting for a chance to be a father, and he wasn't going to give up. The days that followed were unlike anything Alexander Hayes had experienced before. His life, once dominated by calculated precision and high-stakes decision-making, began to revolve around moments he couldn't predict or control. His interactions with Ethan were fleeting but meaningful, each one peeling back a layer of the boy's world and his own. It started with small gestures. Alexander found himself stopping by Bright Futures Foundation after his meetings, often under the guise of checking in on a project or offering support for the organization. Each visit brought him closer to Ethan, and while the boy still didn't know the truth of their connection, their bond was beginning to form. One crisp Saturday morning, Alexander arrived at the foundation with a bag of donuts from a small bakery he remembered from his childhood. The place was still tucked into a corner of Brooklyn, its faded sign reading Sammy's Sweet Spot. The smell of fresh cinnamon rolls and apple fritters had triggered a wave of nostalgia, prompting him to buy far more than he needed. When he entered the playroom, Ethan was seated at a child-sized table, hunched over a puzzle that looked far too complex for his age. He was deep in concentration, his brow furrowed and his tongue poking out slightly, a habit Alexander vaguely remembered having himself at that age. "Morning," Alexander said, his voice careful not to startle the boy. Ethan looked up, his face lighting up at the sight of the bag. "What's that?" "Breakfast," Alexander replied, setting the bag down on the table. "You like donuts?" Ethan grinned. "Do I like donuts? Are you kidding? They're my favorite." Alexander chuckled, pulling out a chocolate-glazed donut and handing it to him. Ethan took a big bite, his eyes widening as the sweetness hit his taste buds. "Whoa, these are good," he said through a mouthful of donut. "Where'd you get them?" Sammy's sweet spot. It's been around forever. My dad used to take me there when I was a kid. Ethan tilted his head. Your dad sounds cool. Alexander paused, the comment catching him off guard. He was. Tough, but cool. Did he like donuts too? Ethan asked, his curiosity genuine. Alexander smiled faintly. He had a sweet tooth, just like you. Over the course of the morning, Alexander found himself drawn deeper into Ethan's world. They worked on the puzzle together, and though it took longer than Alexander would have liked, the boy's excitement at finishing it was worth every second. Look, Ethan exclaimed, pointing to the completed image of a sprawling jungle scene. We did it! Alexander smiled, feeling an unfamiliar warmth settle in his chest. We make a good team. Yeah, Ethan said, beaming. Maybe you can help me with my Lego castle next time. It's gonna be huge. Deal, Alexander said, ruffling the boy's hair. From the doorway, Isabella watched silently, her arms crossed. She hadn't intervened all morning, and Alexander was grateful for her restraint. But he could feel her presence, her watchful gaze a reminder that this was still unfamiliar territory for all of them. Later that afternoon, Isabella pulled Alexander aside as Ethan joined a group of kids for an art activity. They stood near the coffee station, the hum of chatter filling the room. He's getting attached, she said, her voice low. Alexander met her gaze, his expression serious. Isn't that the point? Isabella sighed, running a hand through her hair. It's not that simple. You're new to him, Alexander, to his life. And if you leave, if you decide this is too much or too messy, it's going to hurt him. I'm not leaving, Alexander said firmly. I told you that. Her eyes softened slightly, but her skepticism remained. I believe you mean that now. But this isn't just about showing up once a week and playing with Legos. He's a kid. He needs stability, consistency. I can give him that, Alexander replied, if you let me. Isabella hesitated, her guard wavering. It's not just about what you want, Alexander. It's about what's best for Ethan. And you don't think having his father in his life is best for him? Her jaw tightened, and for a moment she looked as though she might argue. But then her expression softened, and she shook her head. I don't know. That's the truth. I don't know what's best. Alexander reached out, his hand brushing hers briefly. Let me prove it to you. To both of you. Isabella studied him for a long moment before nodding reluctantly. We'll see. That evening, as Alexander walked back to his car, he noticed a small handprint in the condensation on the passenger window. Ethan's. The sight stopped him in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. It was such a small thing, fleeting and insignificant in the grand scheme of his life. But to Alexander, it was everything. It was a reminder of what he was fighting for, not just a connection to his son, but the chance to rewrite his story, to be the kind of father he had never known how to be. The journey was only beginning, and the road ahead was uncertain. But for the first time in years, Alexander felt a sense of purpose that went beyond boardrooms and bottom lines. He wasn't just building a legacy anymore, he was building a life. The sound of rain tapping against the penthouse windows was soothing, almost hypnotic. Alexander sat at his dining table, a half-empty glass of wine in front of him, and a stack of old photographs spread out across the polished surface. Most of the pictures were from his childhood, yellowed at the edges, but still vibrant with memories. He hadn't looked at them in years, hadn't wanted to, but now they felt like pieces of a puzzle he was desperate to solve. One photo caught his attention. It was of his father, Marcus Hayes, standing in their small backyard. He was holding a young Alexander on his shoulders, both of them laughing. The memory was distant, fuzzy, but the feeling of safety and pride it evoked was undeniable. Marcus had been a man of contradictions, strict and unyielding, yet fiercely protective. His love had been quiet, expressed through actions rather than words. Alexander had spent most of his life trying to emulate that strength, to build something his father would have been proud of. But now, as he stared at the photograph, he wondered if Marcus would have approved of the man he had become. Would he have understood the choices Alexander had made? Would he have forgiven the mistakes? The next morning, Alexander found himself walking through Central Park. The air was crisp, and the city felt alive in a way that only autumn could bring. He hadn't planned to come here, but the solitude of his penthouse had been stifling, and the park offered a rare sense of anonymity. As he strolled along the winding paths, his mind drifted back to Ethan, the boy's laughter, his boundless energy, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about his Lego castle. It was all so familiar, yet so foreign. Alexander had spent years avoiding personal connections, convincing himself that they were distractions. But Ethan was different. He wasn't a distraction. He was a revelation. Alexander stopped at a bench near the lake and sat down, pulling his phone from his pocket. He hesitated for a moment before dialing a number he hadn't used in years. It rang twice before a voice answered. Alexander. To what do I owe the pleasure? It was Eleanor Hayes, his stepmother. Her voice was as polished and sharp as he remembered, each word carrying the weight of her socialite persona. Eleanor, Alexander began, his tone measured. I need to ask you something. About my father. There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a soft exhale. This is unexpected. You don't usually like to talk about him. I know, he admitted, but things have changed. Eleanor's tone softened slightly. What do you want to know? Alexander leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Did he ever regret the way he raised me? The choices he made? Eleanor's laugh was dry, almost wistful. Marcus was a man who lived by his principles, Alexander. He didn't believe in regret. But he did believe in legacy. He wanted you to be strong, to succeed, and he was proud of you, even if he didn't always show it. Alexander swallowed hard, her words cutting deeper than he had expected. I think I understand that now, more than I ever did before. There was a pause, and then Eleanor said, Alexander, what's this really about? He hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Finally, he said, it's about family, and trying to do better. Eleanor's voice softened further. Well, whatever it is, I hope you find your way. Marcus always believed you would. Later that afternoon, Alexander arrived at Bright Futures Foundation for another visit. The center was buzzing with activity, children laughing and running between rooms as volunteers tried to maintain some semblance of order. Ethan spotted him almost immediately and ran over, his face lighting up with excitement. You're back. Alexander smiled, crouching down to meet him at eye level. I told you I'd help with that Lego castle, didn't I? Ethan nodded eagerly, grabbing Alexander's hand and pulling him toward the playroom. The table was already strewn with colorful bricks, the beginnings of a fortress taking shape. As they worked together, Ethan chattered non-stop, telling Alexander about his school projects, his favorite superhero, and the dog he hoped to adopt someday. Alexander listened intently, soaking in every detail. It was a side of him he hadn't known existed, the ability to be present, to care without calculation. Isabella watched from a distance, her expression unreadable. She had been more reserved since their last conversation, her skepticism still evident. But there was a flicker of something else in her eyes now, something softer, more hopeful. As the afternoon wore on, Alexander noticed a subtle shift in Ethan's demeanor. The boy's usual exuberance gave way to quiet concentration as he added the final touches to the castle. When it was complete, he stepped back, his face glowing with pride. We did it, Ethan exclaimed, throwing his arms in the air. Alexander grinned. It's impressive. You're quite the architect. Ethan looked up at him, his expression serious. Do you think my dad would have liked it? The question hit Alexander like a punch to the gut. He froze, his mind racing as he tried to formulate an answer. I think he would have loved it, he said finally, his voice steady but soft. You're a pretty amazing kid. Ethan beamed, seemingly satisfied with the response. But Alexander couldn't shake the weight of the moment. The boy didn't know the truth, but his words carried a depth that belied his age. Later that evening, as Alexander prepared to leave, Isabella approached him in the hallway. Her arms were crossed, but her expression was less guarded than usual. "He talks about his dad sometimes," she said quietly. "I've tried to fill the gaps, but there's only so much I can do." Alexander nodded, his chest tightening. "I don't want to be a gap," he said. "I want to be there for him, for both of you." Isabella studied him for a long moment, her gaze searching his face. "You've been good with him, but this isn't just about today or tomorrow. It's about the long haul." "I know," Alexander said, his voice firm, "and I'm not going anywhere." Her lips curved into a faint, hesitant smile. "We'll see." As he stepped into the crisp evening air, Alexander felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time it felt like he was beginning to bridge the gap, not just with Ethan, but with Isabella, and maybe, just maybe, with himself. The days turned into weeks, and Alexander's visits to Bright Futures Foundation became a regular part of his life. Each time he walked through those doors, he felt the weight of his ambition, the relentless drive that had shaped his world shift into something more meaningful. With every Lego tower built, every puzzle solved, and every story shared, the bond between him and Ethan grew stronger. Ethan's curiosity about Alexander deepened, though the boy never pressed beyond innocent questions. Yet, his perceptive nature couldn't be ignored. One evening, as they sat side by side working on a new project, Ethan tilted his head thoughtfully. "You're here a lot," Ethan said, his tone casual but inquisitive. Alexander paused, his hand stilling over the Lego brick in his palm. "I like being here," he replied carefully. "I like spending time with you." Ethan smiled, but his gaze lingered on Alexander for a moment longer. "You're kinda like a dad," he said softly, the words carrying the weight of unspoken truth. Alexander's chest tightened, and for a moment he couldn't speak. He had been waiting for this moment, dreading and hoping for it in equal measure. Before he could respond, Isabella appeared in the doorway, her expression a mix of surprise and concern. "Ethan," she said gently, "why don't you start cleaning up? It's almost dinner time." Ethan nodded, hopping up from his seat and gathering the scattered bricks. He gave Alexander a quick smile before heading toward the shelves. As the boy disappeared from sight, Isabella turned to Alexander, her arms crossed but her expression softer than usual. "He's starting to ask questions," she said, her voice low. "I know," Alexander replied, his tone steady, "and I think it's time he gets answers." Isabella hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the playroom. "This isn't something you can undo, Alexander. Once he knows, it changes everything." "I want him to know," Alexander said firmly. "He deserves to know." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay, but we do this together." That weekend, Isabella invited Alexander to their small apartment for dinner. It was the first time he had stepped into their home, and he was struck by how warm and lived in it felt. The walls were adorned with Ethan's drawings, framed photos of him at various stages of childhood, and a few modest decorations that spoke to Isabella's love of simplicity. The three of them sat around the table, the conversation light and easy as they ate. Ethan was his usual animated self, chattering about a science experiment he had done at school. But as the meal wound down, Isabella cleared her throat and set her fork down carefully. "Ethan," she began, her voice calm but serious, "there's something we need to talk about." The boy looked up, his curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Alexander leaned forward slightly, his heart pounding in his chest. "It's about me," he said gently, "and about us." Ethan's brow furrowed, but he stayed quiet, his gaze shifting between the two adults. "You've asked about your dad before," Isabella continued, "and I've always told you that he wasn't here, but he is here now." Ethan's eyes widened as he turned to Alexander. "You mean—" Alexander nodded, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm your dad, Ethan." The boy's face shifted through a range of emotions, surprise, confusion, and finally, a tentative smile. "You're my dad?" he repeated as if testing the words. "I am," Alexander said, "and I'm so sorry I wasn't here before. But I want to be here now, if you'll let me." Ethan stared at him for a long moment, his small hands gripping the edge of the table. Then, without a word, he stood and walked around to where Alexander sat. He looked up at him, his expression serious but hopeful. "Are you going to stay?" Ethan asked quietly. Alexander's throat tightened and he nodded. "I'm staying, always." Ethan smiled then, a wide, bright smile that lit up his entire face. He threw his arms around Alexander's neck, hugging him tightly. Alexander held him close, feeling the weight of his son's trust settle into his heart. Later that evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, Alexander and Isabella sat together on the small couch in the living room. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with a shared sense of relief and hope. "You handled that well," Isabella said, her tone light but sincere. "I wasn't sure how he'd take it," Alexander admitted. "But he's incredible." "He is," Isabella agreed, a soft smile touching her lips. "And he's lucky to have you, even if it took you a while to get here." Alexander met her gaze, his expression serious. "Thank you for giving me the chance to be part of his life, and for everything you've done for him." Isabella looked away, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Just don't let him down, Alexander. He deserves better than that." "I won't," he promised. In the weeks that followed, their lives began to intertwine in ways Alexander hadn't thought possible. He attended Ethan's school events, helped with homework, and even joined him for weekend soccer games. The boy's joy was infectious, and Alexander found himself smiling more than he had in years. His relationship with Isabella also began to shift. The walls between them gradually lowered, replaced by moments of quiet understanding and shared laughter. They weren't a perfect family, far from it, but they were building something real, something meaningful. One evening, as they all sat together watching a movie, Ethan turned to Alexander with a mischievous grin. "Hey, Dad?" Alexander's heart swelled at the word. "Yeah, buddy. Can we get a dog?" Ethan asked, his eyes sparkling. Alexander laughed, glancing at Isabella, who rolled her eyes but smiled. "We'll see," he said, ruffling the boy's hair. And for the first time in a long time, Alexander felt at peace. He had spent years chasing success, building an empire, and searching for purpose. But here, in this small apartment with his son and the woman who had taught him what family truly meant, he realized he had found everything he'd been looking for. And so, Alexander's journey reminds us that life's greatest treasures aren't found in boardrooms or bank accounts, but in the connections we build and the love we nurture. From a man consumed by ambition to a father embracing a second chance, this story proves it's never too late to rewrite your legacy. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Join us for more incredible tales of transformation, resilience, and hope. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.